before I got the position that I'm in right now, my whole life's purpose had been set, right? And the work that I had been doing was a reflection of that purpose. When I was running, I tell people all the time, more than just having been the first African American elected to this position, the first African American woman to serve in this position, I was a kid who came from public housing, lived in a segment of Chicago that people don't like to talk about. Or when they do talk about it, there's a narrative that they have about poor people of color who live in public housing and the like. And so the fact that I went to law school and graduated, one of the first things that people will always say to me is, how did you do it? How did you make it? And that is based on the premise that people like me aren't supposed to make it. That they recognize that the systems that I grew up in and managed to survive were supposed to have either killed me or failed me. I've made it my mission, not just in this office, but to show up with that experience in everything that I do, whether it was representing kids who were in the foster care system, whether it was volunteering, whether it was serving on the board as president of Planned Parenthood of Illinois, because my mother couldn't get an abortion years ago. And so all of those experiences, to me, set purpose. The position is fortunate, right? The position is, I'm very privileged and honored to have been elected to this position, but it doesn't define where my priorities are. My priorities were set back in the 70s when I came onto this earth. And it was, how do you then use your position to amplify what that purpose is? I'm very mindful, I'm very deliberate about always rooting whatever it is that I do, whether it's policy decisions around bail reform or wrongful convictions or fines and fees or mass incarceration, rooted in the fact that I don't know how I was able to traverse the system that was supposed to kill me. So my purpose has always been to not leave the people behind that were not as fortunate as me. Position comes and goes. I'm from Chicago, and that what you recognize in political office and the like is that flavor today is gone tomorrow. But purpose and commitment to community, you can't shake that. And so if I'm able to shepherd that in through the policies that I have, through the people that I bring on board, that's what it's all about. So it's never been about position, though I'm honored and privileged to hold this position. Always been about, why are you here? What happens when you leave this earth? Have you made it better, not just for you, but the people like you who don't get a chance to get into these rooms? I mean, the statement that was made yesterday, I don't show up by myself. Right. The bravery in the spaces that I'm in to take on the things that I take is that there are people who are never going to have the chance to sit where I sit, and so I owe it to them. That is my purpose. I think first you have to acknowledge that there's room for all the stories, right? I think what has happened is when we talk about issues related to women, there's like one narrative that generally emerges, and there's this theory that if we lose and get distracted by talking about other things, whether it's race or class or sexuality, that it will lose the bigger mission, right? There's some fundamental truths that we know, that the inequity that we see, or the gender inequity, is real. We know it. It affects all women, but at varying levels. Right? And so when we don't talk, if we start talking about the levels, if we start talking about the gender wage gap, if we start saying it's 79 cents and then African American women are like 63 cents and Latinos are like it's 55, Latinas is like it's 55 cents. I've seen it myself where it's like, well, let's not go all the way there. If we get to like 79 cents, that's better than where we were. And the struggle that you will find, that I will speak of for women of color, is like, we can't concede that part of ourselves. And I think that's some of what you've heard over the course of the last couple of days, that we can be rooted in the same cause of gender equity, of pay equity, but equity for you may not be the same for me. I want you to get yours because I will get mine, but not by being quiet. And I think when we look through history, when we look at the suffragist movement, which this is like eerily familiar to what we were seeing, 100 plus years ago, where it's wait, let's focus on one thing at a time. And then this territorialism where it becomes, well, I don't want you to think that your thing is more important than mine. And that's what you start feeling like. It's why is this so important? That only affects you, but again, I think the emerging theme of we aren't all free until all of us are free allows for us to be able to say, well, let's lock arms. Maybe I don't understand because that's not the perspective that I come from, but I validate its importance by giving you the space to do it. But I think what I've seen, just in my experience in the last year or so, particularly because the angst has been so high as it relates to Donald Trump, particularly because we've seen this administration, and it's like, well, we have to unify. And unity doesn't mean do what I say. She said we can be honest. She said we can talk truth. It doesn't mean that those who have the biggest mic get to dictate what that looks like. And so when we talk about inclusivity, when we talk about intersectionality, when we talk about all of those things matter and that we can, in fact, move agendas more broadly, it means that we have to sometimes step back and hear painful things. I hadn't thought about what it means to be in this space and talking about these things from the perspective of someone who's disabled. Ask myself, how many people have I excluded from things, how many policies have I enacted that hadn't even thought about that seat at the table that I have missed out on, that my agenda is not even nearly as full or as rich as it could be because I hadn't even thought about that perspective. And so I think that's what gets in the way, is that we believe, and listen, my struggle, my lens, how I came into this world that shapes my influence is mine and others like mine. But for my sisters here, I have to be just as concerned and give you the space if I can articulate it, because it makes it richer for all of us. But we have to have the humility to know that we have to do that. And I think that's a barrier. In the urgency comes the wanting to cut corners and have a common theme that leaves a lot of people out. Yeah, the world. Listen, so I am the top prosecutor in Chicago, which is, people don't recognize it in the field of prosecution. And we talk about criminal justice reform, what that looks like. I know I have some Chicago people here. You may be under the assumption that this is normal. 79% of elected prosecutors in the United States are white men. 79%. 16% are white women. Less than 1% are women of color. Less than 1% are 2,400. If even just in my office, I have an office of about 1,200 people. For many people, it's the first time that they've had an African-American boss, an African-American woman boss. I'm a part of an association in my state where I am the only African-American woman out of 102 prosecutors in my state. And so even in this position, when you statistically, mathematically, and by the way, I have like the other women of color prosecutors, like we're all in the same group chat, but the challenges are very different from us. Someone sent me a racist threat to my children a couple months ago. And the first thing I did was I got on a group chat with Marilyn Mosby out of Baltimore, with Aramis Ayala out of Orlando, Sherry Boston out of Atlanta. All of us had children. All of us had received racist threats. It was a community that we were able to kind of fortify each other, but on a thread. But when I go out into the world doing this job in a space where people don't look like me who have this job, I am always uncomfortable. I am constantly in discomfort. And I say that not in a sense that people will tell you, when you signed up for it, which I did, but it is not a comfortable position to be in. So for all the purpose and all the reasons that I ran for it, every day that I show up at this job, there are people who don't believe I should be there. There are people who are actively working against me being there in a system that has impact on people's lives, like it's life or death. It has collateral consequences on generations. And when you occupy a space, right, if you are now allowed into the space, or you've broken it, not even allowed, you broke your way into the space, you are constantly battling that. And so there is not a space, if I'm being honest, that I go to, that I am like, oh, I'm straight, maybe my sorority meetings, if I paid my dues. Because even there, the treasurer is like, you don't belong here. But short of that, short of when I owe people money, there's very few spaces that I go to where I feel 100% comfortable. Even this weekend, where I'm excited and I'm energized, but I know that when we talk about some of these issues, I can sit on a panel with my colleagues in other cities and states who aren't women of color. I can and tell them that when I try to implement a policy around bail reform, it looks very different when I try to do it, and it has an impact on people of color. The narrative is very different about my motives than someone else. That every time that I say things that are right, either they're discounted. She's always talking about race. But when a white man talks about race, they want to jump up, clap up and down, look at it, he gets it. He gets it. You let me talk about it, that's all she talks about. And so it is a constant discomfort. It is a constant battle for what it means to be in this skin. And it's also why, if I'm being honest, I don't mind making other people uncomfortable. I don't mind pushing conversations that make people uncomfortable. I have been uncomfortable. I come from generations of people who have been discomforted by the systems that are here. I come from, and not by choice, I come from generations of people who have had to live in existence that is either muted or suffering. And so when I get into these spaces, when I'm talking about issues that have an impact on communities that have been marginalized, that make people uncomfortable. I mean, I did a speech last week in a largely white male audience about look at this audience and ask yourself, why are you all more comfortable buying tickets to come to this thing? And I said, I'm uncomfortable. And they were like, how dare she say she's uncomfortable? How dare you have a room that doesn't have women in it, or doesn't have women of color in it? How dare you be comfortable in a workplace where you don't have diversity reflected? And what I've learned from that is if you are afraid to show up in the uncomfortable space, if you are thinking about what is the impact, because maybe you will go to jail. Hell, maybe you will be killed. That's real. But the question that you have to ask is your moment of discomfort worth the oppression that comes, not even discomfort, the oppression that comes from your absence. And I think there are people who have suffered far more than I have, for far longer than I have, for me to have the privilege to be comfortable holding back.